First, we'd really like to acknowledge all of you for being here because you chose here to be with us today and to support us. The speakers, Laura, Paul, Dylan, and myself, and you could be anywhere else right now, and instead you're here with us. So thank you, we really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll be able to get your minds thinking about something new.
Yes, thank you. Today, Maggie and I decided to get together and talk about a new way of viewing the adjustment. So, have you guys noticed our world is becoming more and more complex? I was born in 1979. In 1980, there was no such thing as a personal computer. AT&T was the only phone company in the US to look at where we are today with technology, the complexity. Think about when you go shopping at the grocery store. You're just looking for a can of beans. You look on the back, you look at the ingredients, there's 30 to 50 ingredients just in a can of beans. Think
at the wrong place, Dylan.
Think about when you go shopping for a pair of jeans, right, Mo? Jeans. You got like 120 different style choices to make, right? There's complexity everywhere we look these days. It's not a good or bad thing. But is there something that we're overlooking by focusing on the details?
And it's important for us to recognize when these details are serving us. So there is no positive or negative about a detail or complex world, but when is that serving you? What's the answer to that? Maybe it's overlooked. Maybe simplicity is overlooked. So when I say the word simplicity, what do you think of?
I think of positive, negative. I think of black, white. I think of yin and yang. I think of harmony between yin and yang. I think of male, female.
So what I'm understanding from you is that it's a two-part system that's constantly in balance. So Dylan and I thought about this. We thought about this two-part system and how it's all-encompassing. So these details are important, but they somehow fit into a two-part system. Without black, there's no white. Without male, there's no female. And we came up with two words, open and protected. And we felt that these two words create a new system. And we're going to give you a few examples of what that system looks like. So we were talking about open and closed systems or open and protected systems, and the most macro example we could think of was one that's universal.
Night and day.
And day. So we can't have night without day. Our Earth spins on its axis for 24 plus a few minutes each day, right? And in that period, we have night and day. And that changes in cycles throughout the year. But in that time, we see shifts. We see a shift between darkness and light, cold and warmth, and then we can divide it a little bit more, get a little more detail-oriented, and look at seasons, right? We've got seasons. We oscillate around we circle around the sun, and we have different seasons. We have summer, winter, spring, and fall. And they each have certain characteristics. And each one of those seasons is incredibly important to the success of the ecosystem of our planet. So, that being said, if we're in this state of summer, winter, spring, fall, and they're sort of in this system that encompasses one, how do we maintain life? What does that cycle look like between this oscillating system?
What happens when it's not in balance? What happens when you have a long period of drought, like we're having right now in Northern California?
So ordinarily, we might see, in the springtime, we might see rainfall. And that rainfall is going to leave us with grass and flowers and trees and new buds and crops to feed ourselves with, water to drink. But what happens in the absence of that, right? So we know typically in summer it rains less, and we see that. And then it gets back to winter and we see snow. But in the absence of that cycle, in the absence of that ebb and flow of the protected state, the rainfall coming down onto the earth, and then the openness, the expansion, the growth that happens that serves us as beings, what happens when that shifts? A state of habituation, right? So we see a period of drought. I'm from Colorado, and we've seen 20-year droughts. Can you imagine the impact that has on the ecosystem? Certain plants are going to survive, certain plants are not. What does the food look like? Where is it coming from? What you might have been able to grow in a season with rainfall, you might not be able to 20 years later. Is that going to change the soil? Is that going to change the birds, the insects, the trees, the animals, the elk, the humans that live in that ecosystem? Absolutely. In a state of habituation, we're going to see a distortion of the ecosystem. That's going to change the ecosystem. Or, some would say, our ecosystem.
So some of you may be wondering, okay, great. We're talking about the climate, we're talking about the big picture, right? How does this actually apply to me and my life? How does it apply to the human body? So let me just tell you a quick story. When I first came to Life West, I loved riding my bike. And I was riding my bike to and from school every day, about 5 miles to school, 5 miles from. So it was about 40 minutes total. And I was wearing this bag on my back every day. Looks like it has a lot of support, room for the spine here in the middle, right? Every day to and from school. And I would, when I saw my intern, he would adjust me and he would always find a subluxation at T12, right in my mid-back, every time. And I was feeling pain there too. And it took me 6 weeks to realize, many of you may have realized it in like 2 days. It took me 6 weeks to realize maybe there's something about my backpack. Now, or just carrying a backpack on my bike. So he would adjust me and the subluxation would alleviate, but then days later it would just come back. So there was something I was doing in the habituation of carrying that backpack. So as soon as I stopped carrying the backpack and I got a pannier bag, which just clipped on right behind my seat, and my spine was free to go and move while I was riding the bike, within 2 to 3 days, I didn't have the same pain I had before. I didn't have that subluxation show up when my intern was checking me. So I was in a state of protection due to that habituation. Now, protection is not necessarily a bad thing, right? My body was adapting to the protective state because of this habit that I had of constantly carrying the bag on my back. So, that being said,
So when is this serving as in chiropractic? I'm just giving a beautiful example of a physical subluxation created from a habitual activity of carrying a backpack that after he had been adjusted, he could adapt back into a state of openness and his system could move freely. But in the absence of that subluxation with the habituation of this activity, he was staying there. So not only was the adjustment doing something beneficial, it was also removing the root cause and finding another route, right?
Yep.
But the purpose was that your body was making the shift to protect itself. So we can go even smaller. We can look at these details even more. And we can look at GI tract stuff, right? We're going to see people who come into our office who have problems in their GI tract, okay? Their body is responding to something that's coming into their system. The pancreas is secreting amylase and lipase and peptidase, and it's doing its job. It's getting some message from the brain to do something about the food that's entering our system. Okay, great. We're operating up, down, inside out, no problem. So what happens if we eat something that's less than satisfactory for our system? We might go into a state of protection. We might experience stomach cramps temporarily, and once the body passes that, hey, we're back into a state of openness. But what if that habit becomes habituated? Then we might see a distortion of the system. We might start to see some sort of of Crohn's disease or bowel cancer or celiac or whatever it might be, there's going to be some sort of adverse reaction to a habitual behavior that's harming the system. But the body is still doing its job. It's still telling us we need to secrete, but maybe it's out of balance, right? It's not doing the right amount because whatever we're putting in is changing the structure of the system. I know that's an extreme example, and it's also very detailed, but bringing it back to something more simplistic, when that person comes into your office, it's absolutely 100% important to recognize that there is some sort of physiological state happening, and addressing that is important. But when I lay that person down on my table,
Yeah.
what am I ultimately concerned with?
What's the lens that you're going to view that person through? Are you going to be concerned with the details? Are you going to be thinking about what's the level of amylase being secreted by this person? Are you going to be thinking about what's going on at the level of at the molecular level? Or are you going to approach them, and I just want to have you just consider approaching them with the binary system. And what does it look like when you have someone who's in a state of contraction versus a state of openness? Is it important to adjust, to introduce and give a force into a system that's open? What does it mean to adjust a system that's closed? Or if we have a system that's in a state of closedness or contraction, how can we open that up? Or how can we find the opening?
So when we administer a chiropractic adjustment, we believe that it's really important to consider the body as a whole that operates in two parts. One that's a state of openness and one that's a state of closeness. And what effect can we have on the system to change that, to allow for the adjustment to be more effective? And as we both mentioned, with his backpack being a detail about his subluxation and or the type of food we're eating and changing the physiology of the tract, that's not to be overlooked. And those are details that the history of knowing this person are important. But when we're actually working with that person's body and they're on your table, what are you going to consider? How are you going to consider it? Are you thinking about amylase? Or are you thinking about opening them up?
Thank you.